So if you have a copy of your Bible this morning, you're going to need that. So we're going to be in Exodus chapter 21, 22, and part of chapter 23. And so I'd encourage you, if you don't have a physical copy of the Bible, to use one of the pew Bibles, because we're only moving around a lot in this passage. So if you have one of those black pew Bibles, in the black Bible, it's page 62 and 63. So as we come to Exodus chapter 21 and 22, we come to a passage of Scripture that most of us tend to skip in our Bible reading plans. We get to Exodus chapter 21 after the Ten Commandments, and we read this. Now these are the rules that you shall set before them when you buy a Hebrew slave. Okay, that's strange, you think. Let's go down to the next paragraph. Next paragraph, when a man sells his daughter as a slave. Okay, that's a weird way to wake up on a Thursday morning. Haven't done that, nor am I willing to, so you note you're not a Hebrew. You don't own slaves, so you breeze down a little bit, and you notice there's a whole lot of rules about livestock. Verse 28 of chapter 21, when an ox gores a man or a woman to death. Okay, verse 35, when an ox butts another so that it dies. Okay, chapter 22, verse 10, if a man gives to his neighbor a donkey or an ox or a sheep or any beast to keep safe. Well, I haven't done that in the past, 40 years that I've been alive, so what in the world does this have to do with me? So after a few paragraphs, we kind of swiftly move along in our reading. So these chapters can be very dry, sometimes dull, confusing, sometimes outdated. And so we have a hard time understanding how this portion of Scripture connects with our weekday, day-to-day life. We're very prone to skip these chapters. And I've also never seen any of these verses emboldened on a coffee cup or in an Instagram feed. I've never woken up and says, you shall commit a sorceress to death. Exodus 22:18, my nice cup of tea there. So we're prone to skip these, and I won't throw anybody under the proverbial cruise ship, but I'll point out that somebody took a week of vacation to avoid this passage this week. Or maybe he's just trying to apply the Sabbath laws to his life. I don't know. But since we are dedicated to a verse-by-verse, chapter-by-chapter, line-by-line exegetical teaching here at Lookout Valley Baptist Church, we will determine to press on into these chapters. These are here in the Bible for a reason. We can learn from these because this is a word from our God, and it does stand in importance to us. And we can't cover all of this. Don't worry, we will get to the taco bar at some point today. There's simply too much material to go line by line, but what I want to do is look at some overarching themes of what's going on in this section. What is God trying to teach the people of Israel in their day? And how do these themes show up in the Jesus story in our day? So let's think about that story for just a moment. Let's find our place in the story of Exodus. We have to remind ourselves where we're at, because the Bible, especially Exodus, is one narrative. So at the beginning of Exodus, we see a 70-person family come down from Canaan into Egypt to be saved from famine. And after 430-something years, this small 70-person family has blossomed and multiplied into a full-fledged nation. Yet these people have been enslaved for most of their time in Egypt. Now, through the book of Exodus, we see God liberating his people through a series of plagues, them going through the Red Sea, God destroying the Egyptian army. So they've journeyed from the wilderness. Now they're encamped in Mount Sinai. This is the story that we've been looking at this year through the book of Exodus. So what is God doing with this group of people? What's going on here? Well, he's taking this single family, descended from Abraham, and fulfilling the promise that he gave that his descendants, his children, would be as multiplied as the stars in the sky and the sand on the sea. So we see the promise to Abraham has come true. And God has formed this people, is moving this people into a nation, a new people group, a new political, social, economic unit. And they're supposed to be a special nation. This is what he calls them out to do in Exodus 19. They are his special people, set aside, devoted to him, holy, set apart. And so they're in their national identity, they're as a group of people, they are to represent Yahweh to the world. So what God is doing in these particular chapters, after the Ten Commandments, he's providing a set of rules, laws, and judgments that will govern and determine how they are to live with one another. So these people needed rules because we all know when you gather a group of people and put them together, no matter how big or how small, if you put those people together, no matter how much they like each other or how much they don't, problems will arise. Whether that's a classroom, a sports team, an office, a family, or church, when people get together, problems and chaos can arrive. And so to paraphrase the notorious B.I.G., mo people, mo problems. I don't know if you can relate to this. I don't know if you've had to break up any fights this week. I have multiple times this week of people about yay big. Why? Because you put people together, conflict ensues. And so what God is doing in these chapters is says He wants His people to live in peace and harmony. He wants them to live with justice and shalom, that peace that infiltrates every part of their society. And what God is doing, and He's setting up this peace and justice in their lives, but He also is pointing to peace and justice in our lives together. And so it's not just because these people are some national geographic unit, although that's true. They are to be more than that. They are to be family. They're to be the household of God. And this household needs some rules. I don't know if you've ever been in a situation with roommates before, or even with your family in your house. If you ever had to share space for a period of time, you know you have to have some kind of established house rules, whether those are unwritten or written. We need something that governs and shapes our lives together. So when I was in seminary, I lived in a house with 3 other guys. And so I knew one of them already. He and I were friends in college, but 2 of the guys I didn't know. And so it didn't take me long to realize that we needed and we should have established some rules right at the very beginning. And so things like, just clean up after yourself. When it's your time to cut the grass, that's your week. Go take care of the yard work for us. We're all on different schedules, so be respectful of where people are sleeping or if they're studying. If the trash can is filled up, the mantra was, he who tops it off, drops it off. You take it outside. You need these rules, right? It's just simple things. One of the rules I didn't know we needed was don't hoard the spoons. I walked into the kitchen one day and could not find any of the spoons. I looked everywhere and finally found one in the bottom of the dishwasher. So I got it, washed it, used it, and washed it again and put it in my cabinet and hid it. Later that day, I asked my roommate, Brian, I said, Brian, you know where the spoons are? He goes, no, man, I've been looking for spoons all morning. So we searched the house. We have a dozen or 2 dozen spoons in this place last week. So we go into the other roommate's room, and not only do we find about 15 spoons, we found bowls and cups and plates and all manner of other things. So we take all the spoons but one. We were gracious, we left him one. We took those spoons, washed them, and hid them. 2 weeks later, he comes, hey guys, you know where all the spoons are? No, man, I hadn't seen a spoon at all. We had our spoon, he had his spoon. So those rules, I didn't know we needed a rule. Don't pilfer the silverware. Don't hide the plates in your room. We need rules that govern how we behave with each other. And so there are initial statutes, do this, don't do that. So the statutes we have in the 10 Commandments. But we also need regulations and guidance of when those rules are broken or how we're to live these rules out in our life. This is what God is doing in chapters 21 through 23. He's expanding the 10 Commandments. And so this section, these chapters are commonly called the Book of the Covenant. So these chapters are set forth, these house rules for the household of God. These rules are how the household is to behave, how it's formed, how they're behaved towards one another that reflects the founder of this household. These laws also give us a glimpse of what the future household of God is supposed to look like and behave as we live with one another. But before we get to the formation and the foundation, let's look at 2 errors. 2 common errors that we can take when we come to this passage. The first error that we need to avoid is one of national adoption. The first error is that we can say is we're going to adopt all these regulations to make these the law of our land today without any change. I'm going to take this Old Testament law and make it the U.S. Civil Code, to put it on the books in Chattanooga today. This interpretation is an error because it does not take into account the historical or redemptive context of the passage. So when we read the Bible, we must always remember that it was written to an original audience. This was given to someone at a particular time for a specific purpose. So these people gathered at the foot of the mountain are God's people. They are His nation. They're His newly constituted people, and He's giving them a law that will govern how they are to live in the promised land. These are not instructions for us today as Americans or even as a church. We can't take these laws and just dump them into the code today because that ignores the historical and redemptive context. Let's look at that historical context. And just for a cursory reading, if you were to breeze through this, you would notice that these people lived in a very different time in a very different place, in a very different culture. It's very agrarian. That's why we have all these livestock examples. We live in an industrial, post-industrial system. Their economic system was totally different than our central banking system. How they handle debt and employment is foreign to us. And not only are they foreign, their neighbors are different from us. They're separate. We're so far removed from their time and place that it's hard for us to take a one-to-one correspondence of seeing what's going on. And so they're supposed to live differently than the people around them. And without this historical knowledge, we get lost in some of the details and we miss the point of some of these rules. But also think about the redemptive context, the story God is telling in the Bible. So throughout the past few weeks, we've made this distinction between the people here in Exodus and our time today. There's many differences. So what's happening in Exodus is at a different scene, on a different stage in the play, in the drama of redemption. We've noticed the difference. There are different covenants. This Mosaic covenant versus the new covenant. This covenant has a different mediator, Moses and Jesus. They're offering different sacrifices, animals, Jesus on the cross. There are different mountains that they've come to, Mount Sinai and Mount Calvary, because these are different peoples, the nation and the church. So this is one error that we need to avoid, this national adoption. Number two, the other error to avoid is total abandonment. Well, if we can't take this wholesale, we might as well just throw all of it out. We can't do that either. We are freed from these laws. We can't just ignore them. But these are not binding on us, not for our salvation, or even for our day-to-day lives, but it just doesn't mean we just rip this page out of the Bible. God put it in here for a reason. This is a word directly from our God. Paul will pick up on this theme that everything written in the Old Testament is for our benefit. Here's what he says in Romans 15, verse 4. For whatever was written in former days was written for our instruction, that through endurance and through the encouragement of the Scriptures we might have hope. So God puts these chapters in here for us to instruct us, to teach us, to encourage us, to point our eyes forward to God so we can have hope. So we can't take these wholesale, adopt all these on the books. We can't just throw them out. We got to figure out what it means in the historical and redemptive context. Spiritually, we do not keep these laws to be saved. We are saved by grace through faith in Christ, who has kept all these laws on our behalf. Yet these rules and judgments can guide, can instruct, can guard how we walk after Christ. And as a practical matter, we don't adopt these laws wholesale, but we can't ignore the fact that our civil law in the West, and especially in America, is based on the logic and principles that undergird the specific instructions in Exodus. The way we've built our society is built on the logic that comes from here. And so let's look at how God uses this book of the covenant to form his people. How does God form his household? What are the household rules for the people of God? So let's look first at the household's formation. And what God is doing in the book of Exodus and what Moses is recording is actually a reordering of creation. The book of Exodus is filled with references moving back to Genesis. God is recreating the world for his people Israel to live in. They have multiplied. They've filled the earth like the birds and the fish of the sea. They've swarmed over the whole land like the insects. Moses and the people are called good, as God pronounced creation good. At the crossing of the Red Sea, God is separating light from darkness. They're crossing through the waters from chaos into order. The tabernacle, which we'll see in the next few weeks, is creating a new Garden of Eden for the people to live in, pointing to a new creation. And so when Pharaoh starts to hinder the Israelites' fruitfulness, God decreates his world. He tears it apart in judgment, and the plagues descend on Egypt. Creation is reversed in the plagues and at the Red Sea. And just as the flood destroyed the old world with Noah, and as Noah is tasked to start the human project over again, the people of Israel are given the same commands. They've come out of the waters of judgment. They've been saved by the grace of God to be pioneers of a new world, a new society. And this world needs order because sin is still present in the people. God must provide structure and discipline for his people to live in. And this law isn't written on their hearts yet. It's written on the wall, on the law, on a rock, on piece of paper. Because these people, just like us, without any laws, without any constraints, they're going to be a rule to themselves. And when everybody's in charge of themselves, anarchy reigns. There has to be some governing authority, some law to constrain how people behave. Because without this order, sin will rip society apart. And so therefore, these laws are actually a grace. Without these laws, society would disintegrate. Our students are going to summer camp this week, and that got me thinking the last time I went to middle school camp. And we had several rooms of students, and we didn't have enough adults to be in every one of the dorm rooms. And after the second day, we go into the room with the oldest students. We go into the room, and it is an absolute disaster. Think of if you have an 8th grader, think about their room at home, and multiply that by 10. By the end of the week, we had filled up 2 55-gallon drums of garbage. Like, how did you bring all this stuff? We go in, there's stuff everywhere. It was like Lord of the Flies had descended on middle school camp. And so people need laws. They need authority. They need to be governed. And this is what God is doing. And we may think that, well, God gives laws, yes, that God gives laws just to kind of keep the universe moving, like gravity or photosynthesis or, the destination of mankind. But God doesn't care about the nitty-gritty parts of life, does he? But when we come to this chapter, we're going to see God give instructions that matter in their details of their life. Look in chapter 22, verse 14. God gives this instruction: if a man borrows anything from his neighbor, and it is injured or dies, the owner not being with it, he shall make full restitution. God cares when you borrow your neighbor's chainsaw. And if you were to break that chainsaw, or if it were to be stolen from you while it was under your care, God says that you are liable to make full restitution. These laws are incredibly practical for the people and even for us, because God cares about the details of our lives, because he cares about us. And so God is reordering creation. He's putting these laws to recreate a people. And these are really just a record of some case laws. Look at verse 21, verse 1. He says, these are the rules that you shall set before them. So the word or term rules there can be translated as judgments or examples. So these chapters are not an exhaustive list of commands of everything that they could possibly face in their lives. These are example judgments that set forth a precedent or a model that they can mediate justice. In the Ten Commandments, we have statutes. Do this, don't do that. In the Book of the Covenant, God is expanding and illustrating what it looks like. So take the 9th commandment, for instance. The 9th commandment, chapter 20, verse 16, you shall not bear false witness against your neighbor. Well, seems straightforward. But if you move forward in chapter 23, God will expand and apply this commandment. He says this: you shall not spread a false report. You shall not join hands with a wicked man to be a malicious witness. You shall not fall in with the many to do evil, nor shall you bear witness in a lawsuit, siding with the many, as so to pervert justice. Nor shall you be partial to a poor man in his lawsuit. So just notice a few examples of what a false witness in the 9th commandment could be. See what's included here: or false report, or gossip, not committing perjury on the witness stand, not perverting justice through lies to help the wicked, to help the rich, or to help the poor. The 9th commandment and these illustrations go to show us that everything we say must be the truth. We must be honest in every portion of our life. Jesus even picks that up, right? Let your yes be yes and your no be no. In all cases, speak the truth. So the statute and the case point to that truth. These laws are recorded to help us apply and live out the commandments in all kinds of ways. But not only these are a record of these case laws for the people, these laws are a repudiation of the Canaanites. Remember that God's people are to be distinct, they're to be different than the world. The way we live our lives, the way they lived our lives, should not be like the pagan neighbors that we have. They were to reflect the God who saved them out of Egypt. They're to be holy, they're to be perfect as God is holy. And if this is the case, they've got to live differently. And this is what the laws here are doing, is showing that the way we live is a repudiation or rejection of how everybody else lives. You can see differences in all kinds of ways, and I'll just mention a few. They're to be different in how they treated slaves or servants under their authority, chapter 21, verse 2 through 11. They are to be different in how they stratified punishment for different crimes, 21, 11 through 20. And how they treated foreigners, how they treated the poor in chapter 22, how they treated enemies in 23, how justice is not to favor the privileged or the oppressed in chapter 21 and 23. All the laws here are to say that you are to be different, you are to be distinct, you're to be unique out of all the nations of the earth. Because you, Israel, you, the church, are to be like the God, like the lawgiver. And these are just some examples of how we and how they are to be distinct. Their behavior, our behavior, is to reflect the lawgiver who gives these laws to his people and then gives laws later to us. And so as God forms his people, they are living their lives out in the midst of a pagan and wicked world. And not only are they living before the eyes of the people, they're living before the eyes of God himself. And as God organizes his people, he puts them together and reminds them that they are his people. He is to dwell with them. They are to live with this truth in mind, that God is actively in their presence. How would you behave if God was sitting right next to you, is what he's saying. And according to Martin Luther, the essence of the Christian life is to live coram Deo, which is a Latin phrase that you can impress your friends and neighbors with later. Coram Deo means before the face of God. We live our lives before God's face. God is here in our presence. And throughout these laws, God is saying that I am with you in all the manner and all the details that go on. For example, if you were to give someone a piece of your property and that they were going to borrow or keep to keep safe, if you're going out of town, you wanted somebody to watch your car, let's say, and that car was stolen, well, what happens then? Who's responsible? Well, God gives instructions about that scenario. Look in chapter 2, verses 8 and 9. He says, if something is stolen, and then verse 8, he says, if the thief is not found, the owner of the house shall come near to God to show whether or not he has put his hand to his neighbor's property. For every breach of trust, whether it is for an ox or a donkey, for sheep, for a cloak, for a car, or for any other lost thing of which one says, well, this is it, the case of both parties, here's the key, shall come before God. And then the one whom God condemns shall pay double to his neighbor. So God is saying, I care about the stolen property that you lent to your neighbor. In those small details, God is present in their lives and in ours. So their lives in this new creation are playing out before the face and presence of God, just as it is before the presence of other people. And this is a promise, it's a covenant, it's a comfort, and it's a warning. It's saying, yes, God is here, but God is also watching. How we behave matters before the people and before God. So God is forming this people to live with him and to be his representatives. But not only does God form the house, God gives us the foundation of the house. So what is the household's foundation? Well, it's not a group of laws. We say often that America is founded on laws and not people and not men. But here, the people aren't founded on laws, they are founded on a lawgiver. The founder of this nation is God himself. He is the father who cares for his family. He's the one establishing. He's the one who knows. He's the one who protects. He's the one who leads. He's the one who provides for his family. And this provision is found here in the laws. It's a grace that he gives them this foundation. In fact, these laws reveal the lawgiver. If we want to know who God is, we look at what he's given to us in this passage. The rules laid out here in the book of the covenant show us who the lawgiver is. And I'll just give you 3 examples. There are many through here, but just look at 3. First, we can see that he is dedicated to the preservation of life. He is dedicated to preserve human life and human flourishing. Everything he gives here is for the good of his people. And so it's even included, he is preserving lives when he calls for capital punishment. And if you read through these chapters, there are several commands to kill someone who has crossed a certain line. And one of the biggest ones we can find in verse 12 and verse 15 of chapter 21. The law says this, whoever strikes a man so that he dies will be put to death. And in verse 15, whoever strikes his father and mother shall be put to death. So basically, if you were to kill someone, your life is demanded of you. This is where we get our idea of capital punishment. Because God values human life so much, he puts the strictest penalty upon it by taking it. If we go back to the Noahic covenant in Genesis chapter 9, God says that whoever ever takes life, his life will be demanded for him. So God is saying that life is precious, so precious that I will take someone's life who took it from them. Men and women are made in the image of God. Taking and marring that image is a direct assault on God himself. And throughout all of this, God is preserving life. He's causing human flourishing to grow. We may think laws restrict and constrain, but what it does, it allows us to live in freedom. It gives us fences to live our lives practically and freely. So he's dedicated to preservation of life. Number two, he is dedicated to justice. So thankfully, not all crimes are met with death. As opposed to other societies in their day, and even in ours, you could be killed for stealing a loaf of bread. I don't know if you remember the old school 1990s animated classic Aladdin. I'm not talking about the heresy that came out a few years ago. Go way back. And so Aladdin, we first meet him, he's on the run because he's stolen a loaf of bread, and the soldiers are out to kill him. And so they lived in a barbaric society that says, whatever you do, if we don't like it, off with your head. So instead, God says there's equivalent punishment given in proportion to the crimes committed. God is dedicated to justice. So he will distinguish between premeditated murder and manslaughter, or accidents, or unintentional death. He is a division between intention, between negligence, and between accidents. Each transgression of the commandments are met with equal justice. 3 quick examples. Thankfully, you won't be put to death for stealing sheep, but you will be forced back to pay a penalty. Chapter 22, verse 1. If a man steals an ox or a sheep or kills it and sells it, he shall repay 5 oxen for an ox, 4 sheep for sheep. If your negligence were to cause the death or loss of property, you're liable to restore the property. Chapter 21, verse 33. When a man opens a pit, or when a man digs a pit and does not cover it, and an ox or donkey falls into it, the owner of the pit shall make restoration. He shall give money to its owner, and the beast shall be his. And then lastly, if someone knocks out your tooth, you can't go back and take an arm for a repayment. Probably the most famous verse here is 21 verses 23 and 25. You shall pay life for life, eye for eye, tooth for tooth, hand for hand, foot for foot, burn for burn, wound for wound, stripe for stripe. These punishments reflect the true justice, the true fairness of God. These commands protect life. They ensure that retaliation doesn't escalate. It says that vigilante justice cannot run rampant. These laws protect the nation from clan warfare. Well, you crashed my car, I'll burn your house down. You broke my nose, I'll break your face. You dug a hole in my yard that killed my cat, I'm going to take your son. These laws here ensure that the Hatfield and McCoy clan warfare rivalry does not take over. Escalation and vigilantism is not justice. Sorry, Batman. So we see God is preserving life. He's dedicated to justice. And lastly, he is concerned for the poor. He is concerned for the poor, the lowly, and the needy. In his preservation of life, God is quick over and over again to protect the most vulnerable of society. From the care of slaves in chapter 21 to the end, God causes people to care for the least of these. We'll read a lengthy section in chapter 22, starting in verse 21. Look at how God causes people to care for the poor and needy. You shall not wrong a sojourner or oppress him, for you were sojourners in the land of Egypt. You shall not mistreat any widow or fatherless child. If you do mistreat them, and they cry out to me, I will surely hear their cry. And my wrath will burn, and I will kill you with the sword, and your wives shall become widows, and your children fatherless. If you lend money to any of my people with you who is poor, you shall not be like a moneylender to him, and you shall not exact interest from him. If ever you take your neighbor's cloak in pledge, you shall return it to him before the sun goes down. For that is his only covering, and it is his cloak for his body. In what else shall he sleep? And if he cries to me, I will hear, and I will have compassion. Do you see God's concern for the immigrant, the sojourner, the widow, the orphan, the poor? They're not to be mistreated. They're not to be taken advantage of. Payday loans are outlawed. These aren't to be extorted. These groups are often neglected, forgotten, reviled, and outcasts in their society and in ours. They're vulnerable, marginalized, but God cares for them. These are just three aspects of who our God is, given through these laws. I know that's hurried and that's quick, but if you were to go through line by line, you would see God character at every point. So we can see how these laws functioned in ancient Israel. God is forming his people. He's founding his people on his holy character. But what does it mean for us? In this different historical and redemptive context, what does it mean? Well, let's look at the household's future. Remember, because this story is going somewhere. God has written this story, the first act here with Israel being the nation of God, the people of God represented by this social, political, and economic unit. But that has now changed, and the people of God are now not a nation, but a church, his body. But we have to remember that there are different rules for different times. Different rules, but the same lawgiver. The sovereign who stands behind the judgments and laws and rules in Exodus 21 stand behind the laws he gives us today. God is the same yesterday, today, and forevermore. It is easy for us to kind of slip in and say, well, that was the God of the Old Testament. He was angry and vindictive. It's Jesus who's loving and caring and forgiving and kind. We can come to Exodus and think, wow, man, the Trinity must have had a really bad few millennia. That flood must have really set them back. So he gave them these awful laws they got to keep. They're harsh. They're ridiculous. But thankfully, Jesus has come along and said everything right. But Jesus doesn't treat the law this way. He doesn't toss it out. He upholds, he honors the entire law. And then, actually, he seeks to intensify portions of the law for his people today, over and above what's recorded here. So when Jesus comes on the scene in our redemptive story, the Jesus story here, he doesn't destroy the record, he actually fulfills it. He summarizes it and gives us the commands to live out. So when we talk about our salvation not being tied to the law, we don't keep the law to be saved. We don't keep the law to be saved because Jesus has already kept this law on our behalf. We are saved by Christ's obedience to God's law. Whether that's his passive obedience, his passionate obedience on the cross, or what we would call his active obedience. Christ is actively upholding the law. Throughout the life, he keeps the law perfectly where we could not. He always lives in accordance with the Ten Commandments. He never breaks one of the laws. He keeps them throughout his life in whole. So he fulfills the law. And so when God justifies us, he imputes the record of Christ's perfection into our account. We who are sinful and broken and deserving death have now been credited with the righteousness of Christ. Where we failed, Christ succeeds. So in his grace, when God looks at us after we've put our faith in him, he does not see us on the docket to be killed. He sees us with the perfect record of Jesus credited to our account. We should be grateful for Christ's active obedience every day. Yet this active obedience of Christ should not give us an excuse to be lazy or to indulge in sin or to ignore God's commandments. The Christian life doesn't work that way. We are not called to follow the external law of God to earn salvation. We can't do that. That's a standard we can't obey. Christ does that for us. Yet we are called to follow the law of God as a result of our salvation. Yet we can't even do that. Therefore, Christ works that in us. Christ dies for us and then it works in us. And he doesn't call us to live according to the law of Moses. He tells us that we are to live according to the law of Christ. And what's the law of Christ? We summarizes that in the law of love. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, your soul, your mind, your strength, and love your neighbor as yourself. And so the book of the covenant in Exodus is examples of how those people in Israel were to love their enemies. When we love our neighbors, when we love our enemies, we love those around us, we won't kill them. We won't steal from them. We won't defraud them. We won't endanger them through negligence or ignorance. We will care for the lowliest and the poor. We will restore what is lost, what is broken, what is stolen, because we care for people. If we care for people, we will love them and not harm them. As God has loved us, we love others. This is what he's exemplifying in Exodus 21. This is what he's commanding us to do today. We can do that through Christ's active obedience. But Christ's active obedience for us leads us to an act of obedience. So what's the Christian's act of obedience? It's to love one another. So all the laws in Exodus 21 through 23 can be summed up in that phrase, love one another. So just think about your church experience for a moment. Have they always been characterized by love, by peace, by patience, by harmony, by justice? The church is always a place where people get together, where they get along with one another, right? We as Christians, we're transformed by the power of God, never to fight again, right? We're brothers and sisters. We're always going to get along. Brothers and sisters in the family never bicker or argue or squabble or fight with each other, right? They're all in love with one another as family. We know that's not the case in our own homes and in the church of God. And so we all have stories of we have not loved well or we have not been loved well. And the New Testament churches, if you look at them, they're full of division and arguments and fighting and quarrels. Paul will go so far to say that, hey, Galatian church, you're biting and devouring and consuming one another. So you need a new law. The law, love one another. It's all summed up here. Loving one another means that we always look out for the interest of others above ourselves. The laws and statutes of Exodus 21 through 23 are fundamentally concerned with the welfare of other people, not ourselves. Humility is at the core of these laws in their day and in our day. The lawgiver is the same. The application may differ, but God always calls us to care for one another, to love one another. And so when God calls the people of Israel to restore what is taken, we are to offer forgiveness, not seeking our demands, but to care for one another. And really to consider not what they have done to me, but what have I done to them? When have I caused harm? When have I defrauded my neighbor? When did I break someone's property and not pay it back? What is something that I lost because of my negligence that I need to make right? Those are the questions that Exodus 21 should stir up in us. So we can see how the Old Testament can map on to the Christian's way of living. Not a one-to-one correspondence, but the lawgiver underneath it undergirds and tells us to love one another, to do good for others, to live in peace and justice. We speak truth to one another. We're not angry or vindictive or vengeful. We don't take advantage of each other. We don't steal or defraud. We don't live in malice towards one another. We are tenderhearted, kind, forgiving one another, caring for those weaker and lower than we are. Our behavior towards church members should mimic and model the lawgiver. God, who's loved and forgiven us, we love and forgive others. He is kind. He is patient. He is loving towards us. Therefore, we are kind, loving, and long-suffering towards others. And so when God's people live together in a family or in this church, we're tasked to live in peace and shalom, exemplifying the law and love of God. We all know that this is impossible in our sinful flesh. So we can think, like in your house, you may put up house rules on your wall, this external law that's outside of us. This is what God is doing. He's writing an external law outside of their hearts and their minds. But those external laws can only contain and regulate sin in the household of God. External laws contain people, but can never change people. We need to be changed from the inside out. External laws can't do that. But this is what the law of Christ does. The active obedience of Christ works on our behalf externally, and then it's applied internally. So when we're saved, we are credited with the active obedience of Christ, and we are equipped with the indwelling Spirit to carry this law out, to actually obey them. We have a new desire. We have a new heart that wants to follow Christ. We have motivation. I will try to keep the law of Christ. I have the ability now. I can follow Christ, and I can love my neighbor because I want to, because my desires have changed, my motivations have changed, my abilities have changed. We no longer live outside the house in the wilderness. We are now brought inside the home. And that law is not on the wall somewhere seeking to conform us, but it guides and guards our hearts because it is on our heart. God, through His Holy Spirit, changes us from the inside to follow the law of love. This law that He gives us is not to keep us down, but to allow peace and justice and mercy and love to flow. This law promotes human flourishing. It establishes His justice, cares for the vulnerable. In the end, it gives life and not death. This law that He gave to the Israelites on the outside, He gives us on the inside to care for others above ourselves because Christ has cared for us. to forgive others who have hurt us because Christ has forgiven us, to love others because Christ has loved us. So now here, echoing the words of chapter 21, verse 1, now here, Lookout Valley, are the rules set before you. Love one another as Christ has loved you. Let's pray.